could make a ship sail on in good order, with food still warm in the galley and no one left aboard to steer her. For generations, sailors have told stories of vessels found empty at sea. Some are legend, others are documented fact. Tonight, we follow several true cases, beginning with a brigantine found drifting near the Azores in 1872. Our story begins there. On a clear afternoon in early December 1872, the crew of a merchant ship called the DEI Gracia noticed something odd on the horizon. Roughly 400 nautical miles from the Azores, a brigantine was sailing under a strange, uneven spread of canvas, yawing slightly from side to side, with no one visible on her deck. Her name, painted along the stern, was the Mary Celeste. Captain David Morehouse of the DEI Gracia knew the ship. He had dined with her captain, Benjamin Briggs, only a few days before both vessels left New York Harbor, bound for different Mediterranean ports. Morehouse watched the strange vessel for some time before deciding to send a small boarding party across. The sea was moderate, the wind steady, and nothing about the Mary Celeste's outward appearance suggested disaster. Her sails were set, though poorly trimmed, as if no one had adjusted them in some time. As the boarding party drew close, they called out, expecting some answer from the deck. None came. What they found aboard was seaworthy and largely undisturbed. There was food and fresh water still stored in her hold, enough for 6 months at sea. The cargo, more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, was almost entirely intact, with only a handful of barrels showing any sign of leakage. Personal belongings sat untouched in the cabins. A sewing machine with a child's dress folded beside it, a chest of the captain's papers, a small harmonium, and other ordinary household objects that suggested no one had planned to leave in a hurry. A sword was found in the captain's cabin, but showed no trace of blood or violence. And yet Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and all 7 crew members were gone. So was the ship's small yawl boat, and so were the chronometer and sextant a captain would take only if he expected to need them. This is the detail that answers the question at the heart of tonight's story. Ghost ships, in the cases we can actually document, were almost never abandoned by choice, and almost never touched by anything supernatural. They were abandoned because someone on board, usually the person in command, made a fast and frightening decision that turned out to be wrong. The Mary Celeste did not need to be abandoned. She was later sailed to port under her own rigging by the very sailors who found her, a 2-man prize crew guiding her alongside the DEI Gracia across nearly 800 miles of opened Atlantic to Gibraltar. But something convinced 10 people that staying aboard was more dangerous than climbing into a small open boat in the middle of the ocean. And once that choice was made, the ocean did not give them a second chance. To understand why a careful, experienced captain like Briggs might have reached that decision, it helps to know something about the ship and the voyage. The Mary Celeste was 12 years old in 1872, a modest two-masted brigantine of some 280 tons, built in Nova Scotia and rebuilt more than once since her keel was first laid, lengthened at one point and fitted with an added deck to increase her cargo capacity. She was not a fast or glamorous vessel, but she was considered sound, and Briggs, who came from a family of sea captains stretching back generations, had bought a 2/5 share in her because he believed in her future. He was 37 years old, known in his home port in Massachusetts as a serious, temperate man, not given to drink or exaggeration, raised almost entirely at sea aboard his father's ships before earning his own command. He had hand-picked his crew of 7, choosing men he trusted or who came recommended by people he trusted, and had made room aboard for his wife Sarah and their young daughter Sophia. Their older son, just 7, stayed behind with relatives in Massachusetts to continue his schooling, a common arrangement for captains who brought family aboard on longer voyages. The voyage did not begin easily. Rough weather delayed the Mary Celeste at the very start, forcing her to wait out a storm near Staten Island before finally clearing New York Harbor. Once underway, the ship spent nearly 2 weeks fighting difficult weather in the North Atlantic, a stretch of ocean notorious in late autumn for sudden, violent storms. Her last confirmed position, recorded in the captain's log on the 25th of November, placed her only a few miles from the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, and noted that her course had shifted, curiously more directly north than her intended route to Gibraltar and on to Italy would have required. 10 days passed between that final log entry and the moment the DEI Gracia's crew spotted her, drifting well off her intended course, roughly 500 nautical miles from where her log said she should have been. Investigators in Gibraltar, where the DEI Gracia brought the derelict ship for a formal legal hearing, searched carefully for any sign of violence and found none. There was no damage to the rigging beyond what ordinary storms might explain, no blood, no sign of a struggle anywhere aboard. What they did find, hidden below in the hold, offered a quieter kind of explanation. Some of the 1,700 alcohol barrels, made of red oak rather than the more common and less porous white oak, had very likely allowed small amounts of vapor to seep out during the rough crossing. In the confined, poorly ventilated space of the cargo hold, sealed against the weather during the worst of the storms, those fumes could have built into something genuinely alarming, a chemical haze, perhaps visible as a faint mist when a hatch was finally opened, that a nervous and exhausted captain might easily mistake for the early stage of a fire or explosion. There is a second piece to this explanation, and it involves something far more mundane than fumes: the ship's pump. Investigators later learned, through examination of the vessel and its recent history, that on a previous voyage the Mary Celeste had carried a cargo of coal, and coal dust and debris left behind may have clogged the pump used to measure how much water had collected in the bilge, the lowest part of the hull. A functioning pump lets a crew measure the water inside a ship's hull with real confidence. A broken or unreliable one leaves a captain guessing, and guessing wrong, in the middle of a storm, in darkness, with a young child and a wife aboard, is a good way to convince yourself that a seaworthy ship is about to sink beneath you. Put these two ordinary problems together: a haze of alcohol vapor rising unexpectedly from the hold, and a pump that could no longer be trusted to give an honest reading, and a very human sequence of events starts to take shape. A ship battered by nearly 2 weeks of storms. A captain uncertain how much water had actually gotten below decks and unable to check with any confidence. The smell or sight of something in the hold that looked, in a moment of exhaustion and poor light, like real and immediate danger. A quick decision to get his wife, his daughter, and his crew into the ship's boat and tie it to the Mary Celeste by a length of rope, intending to wait nearby at a safe distance until the danger passed or until land came into view, and then perhaps that rope breaking under strain or being cut loose in a sudden gust of wind, leaving 10 people in a small open boat on the open Atlantic with no way back to the ship, which continued sailing on, empty, exactly as she had been built to do. No one can say with certainty that this is precisely what happened, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Other explanations have been proposed over the many decades since, including a dispute or mutiny among crew members, an unrecorded stop at a nearby island that went wrong, or a more straightforward error in navigation during poor visibility. None of these alternatives, though, are as well supported by the physical evidence investigators actually documented aboard the ship. An intact and valuable cargo left almost entirely untouched, a cabin full of personal belongings no one would leave behind willingly, a missing boat, missing navigational instruments, and a captain whose training, temperament, and family responsibilities make a hasty, ultimately fatal decision to leave a sound vessel more plausible than almost any other reading of the available facts. What makes the Mary Celeste worth returning to more than a century and a half later is not a mystery that was never solved. It is a mystery that has largely been explained through patient work connecting a ship's cargo manifest, her prior voyages, weather records for the North Atlantic in November 1872, and the physical evidence catalogued at the time, and the explanation turns out to be more interesting and more human than the myths that grew up around it. There was no sea monster, no mutiny dressed up as legend, no ghostly crew spirited away in an instant. There was a merchant family doing an ordinary job on an ordinary autumn crossing, undone by a run of bad weather and 2 small mechanical failures that together were enough to convince 10 careful, sensible people to trust an open boat over the deck of their own ship. It is worth adding that this explanation did not emerge all at once in 1872. It developed gradually over more than a century as later researchers returned to the surviving evidence with tools Briggs's contemporaries never had. In the early 21st century, a documentary filmmaker named Anne McGregor worked with a physical oceanographer from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Phil Richardson, to plot the Mary Celeste's likely course against historical weather records for the North Atlantic in November 1872. Their reconstruction confirmed that the ship had indeed sailed through genuinely severe weather in the days before her final log entry, and that her curious shift toward a more northerly heading was consistent with a captain seeking shelter rather than continuing blindly on his original course. This kind of patient, modern verification matters because it means the explanation offered tonight is not simply the most appealing story among several equally plausible guesses. It is the account best supported by physical evidence, weather history, and the ship's own documented cargo at prior voyages, layered together across more than a century of careful research. It is also worth remembering what the Gibraltar court itself could not have known at the time. The Advocate General who led the inquiry, a man named Frederick Solly Flood, grew so convinced that something criminal must explain the ship's condition that he spent weeks pursuing theories of drunken mutiny among the crew, despite a complete absence of supporting evidence. His suspicion says less about the Mary Celeste than about how difficult it can be, even for a trained legal mind, to accept that a genuinely ordinary sequence of small failures could produce so unsettling an outcome. That same difficulty accepting a quiet explanation for an unsettling event will follow us through every case we look at tonight. That single case tells us something true about nearly every well-documented ghost ship story that followed it. The sea rarely needed anything dramatic to empty a vessel. It only needed fear, timing, and a decision that could not be taken back once it was made. Understanding that pattern is the thread that will carry us through the rest of tonight's journey, from the wooden brigantines of the 1800s to the steel steamers of the Arctic a century later. To understand why a case like the Mary Celeste could happen at all, it helps to step back and look at the kind of vessel she was and the world she sailed through. In the second half of the 19th century, steam power was beginning to change ocean travel, particularly for passengers, but for merchant cargo, sail still ruled a large part of the Atlantic. A brigantine like the Mary Celeste was a working vessel, built for cargo rather than comfort, roughly 103 feet from bow to stern, with two masts carrying a combination of square and fore and aft sails that let a relatively small crew, 10 people in this case, manage her without an enormous number of hands. Below deck, space was tight and carefully divided by rank, a pattern common across merchant vessels of this era. The captain's cabin sat toward the stern, usually the driest and most stable part of ship, and on this particular voyage it doubled as a small family apartment. Surviving descriptions of the Mary Celeste's cabin depict a space fitted out almost domestically, with a sewing machine, a small folding organ, and a modest library of books, alongside a bed built into the wall to keep it from sliding during rough weather. This kind of arrangement was not unusual. Captains on merchant voyages sometimes brought their wives and young children along, particularly on longer runs, since it could be cheaper and more emotionally bearable than maintaining two households an ocean apart for months at a stretch, and a captain's wife often took on informal responsibilities aboard, from basic medical care to keeping the ship's accounts. Forward of the officers' quarters, ordinary seamen slept in a cramped space called the forecastle, often damp, poorly lit by a single lamp or skylight, and shared among several men in bunks stacked close together along the hull. There was little privacy and less comfort. A sailor's sea chest held most of what he owned in the world: a change of clothes, some basic tools, perhaps a Bible, a deck of cards, or a small keepsake from home. Ventilation below deck was limited to what could be achieved through hatches and small vents, which meant that in bad weather, when hatches had to be closed tight against the sea, the air below decks could grow stale, humid, and, as we saw in the case of the Mary Celeste's cargo hold, occasionally dangerous in ways no one could have fully anticipated. The ship herself functioned as a kind of small, self-contained village, entirely dependent on what had been loaded before she left port. Barrels of fresh water, sacks of hard biscuit, salted meat, dried peas, and whatever fresh provisions would keep for the first stretch of the voyage were stowed below, calculated to last the expected length of the crossing with a healthy margin for delay. A voyage from New York to a Mediterranean port like Genoa might reasonably take 4 to 6 weeks under favorable conditions, and a prudent captain, as Briggs appears to have been, loaded enough to comfortably exceed that estimate. This is part of why investigators found so much untouched food and water still aboard the Mary Celeste when she was found. Whatever drove her crew to abandon ship, it was not hunger, thirst, or any failure of planning on Briggs's part. Weather shaped almost everything about a voyage like this one, in ways that can be difficult to appreciate from a modern vantage point. Before radio, a ship at sea had no way to receive a forecast and no way to call for help beyond visual signal flags, which only worked if another vessel happened to be close enough to see them clearly. A captain's decisions were guided entirely by his own observation of sky and sea, a barometer if the ship carried one, and generations of accumulated seafaring knowledge about what a particular set of clouds, a change in wind, or a falling glass usually meant for the hours ahead. The nearly 2 weeks of storms that battered the Mary Celeste near the start of her voyage were not unusual for a November crossing of the North Atlantic, a season and a stretch of ocean well known among sailors for sudden, violent weather systems moving in off the North American coast. What was unusual was how that ordinary hardship combined with 2 mechanical failures to produce an extraordinary and tragic outcome. Life aboard also meant living very close to the rhythms of the ocean itself, in a way that shaped a sailor's whole sense of time and space. Days and nights blurred together according to the system of watches, which we will look at more closely in a later chapter. But the basic experience was constant: the roll and pitch of the hull beneath bare feet, the creak of rigging overhead, the smell of tar, salt, and whatever cargo filled the hold below. On a ship carrying industrial alcohol, that particular smell would have been especially present, a sharp chemical note underlying the more familiar odors of wood, rope, and seawater that filled most working vessels. In calm weather, with hatches open and air circulating freely, it might have gone almost unnoticed by a crew accustomed to the cargo. In a storm, with hatches battened down tight and air trapped below for days at a stretch, it could easily have become something else entirely, thick enough to genuinely alarm even an experienced sailor checking the hold by lamplight. Beyond the ship's rail lay an ocean that, in this period, was busier than many people today might imagine. Shipping lanes between American ports and Europe carried a steady traffic of merchant vessels like the Mary Celeste and the Dei Gratia, both of which, as it happened, had left New York within about a week of each other and were bound for ports not far apart along the same general route. Captains often knew one another personally, or knew of one another by reputation through the tight-knit professional community of merchant shipping that connected ports on both sides of the Atlantic. This is why David Morehouse recognized the Mary Celeste on sight even at a distance, and why the discovery felt personal to him rather than simply a professional curiosity. The Atlantic could feel enormous and empty, and at the same time surprisingly small, a network of familiar faces, familiar ships, and familiar routes crossing paths in the middle of what looked, on a chart, like open nowhere. It is worth noting, too, that regions and eras differed considerably in how this maritime world actually functioned in practice. A brigantine crossing the open Atlantic in the 1870s faced different conditions and different routines than a schooner running lumber and coal along the American coast, or a steel steamer working the ice-choked waters of the Arctic in the 20th century, both of which we will meet later in this story. Wooden hulls, canvas sails, and hand-operated pumps belonged to a particular window of maritime history, one that was already beginning to give way to iron ships and steam engines by the time the Mary Celeste made her final voyage, even if that transition happened at very different speeds in different parts of the shipping world. The rigging itself, which gave a brigantine like the Mary Celeste her distinctive silhouette, deserves a moment of attention, since it shaped so much of the physical work aboard. A brigantine carried square sails on her forward mast, useful for running steadily before a following wind, and fore and aft sails on her mainmast, better suited to sailing closer against the wind when a more direct course was needed. This combination made her more flexible to handle than a fully square-rigged ship, but it still meant that adjusting sail for a change in wind or weather required several crew members working together, hauling on lines that ran from the deck up through a complex system of blocks and pulleys to the yards and gaffs high overhead. In a storm, this work had to be done in darkness, in freezing spray, on a deck that pitched unpredictably underfoot, by men holding on with one hand while working rope with the other. Sound played as large a part in shipboard life as sight. A working brigantine was rarely quiet. Wind moving through rigging produced a constant low hum that shifted in pitch as it strengthened or eased. A sound experienced sailors learned to read almost without thinking, the way a person ashore might read the sky. Wooden hulls groaned and popped as they flexed against the pressure of sea, a noise that could sound alarming to an inexperienced ear but was, most of the time, simply the ordinary voice of a ship doing exactly what she had been built to do. Waves slapped and hissed along the hull, blocks squeaked as sails were adjusted, and somewhere below, the muffled thud of cargo barrels shifting slightly against their lashings added its own low note to the ship's constant, murmuring soundtrack. Sleeping through all of this took practice. A sailor coming aboard for the first time often struggled through his early weeks at sea simply because the ship never really went quiet, and rest had to be found within the noise rather than after it. The cargo hold itself, where the trouble aboard the Mary Celeste most likely began, was a dim, cramped space, quite unlike the open deck above. Barrels were stowed tightly, wedged and lashed against one another to keep them from shifting in rough seas, with only narrow gaps left for a crewman to inspect the load or reach the pump well at the lowest point of the hull. Little natural light reached this space, and in weather bad enough to keep the main hatches closed, whatever air remained inside grew still and close, trapped among 1,700 barrels of cargo that, in this particular case, was never meant to be breathed rather than shipped. It is not difficult to imagine how disorienting it might have felt for a crew member sent below with a lantern to check the pump, only to find the air thick with an unfamiliar sharp smell that had not been there the week before. By the end of the 19th century, this world of wind-powered cargo ships was already old-fashioned in some busy passenger ports and still entirely dominant in others, particularly for bulk cargo where speed mattered less than cost. A reminder that maritime life did not change everywhere at once or at the same pace. It is this uneven, gradually shifting world, part tradition, part hard economic necessity, that produced the system of trade and insurance we will look at next, a system that shaped what happened to abandoned ships like the Mary Celeste long after their crews had vanished into the Atlantic. A ship like the Mary Celeste did not sail for adventure. She sailed because moving goods across an ocean was, and still is, one of the most efficient ways to conduct trade, and because an entire financial and legal system had grown up over roughly 2 centuries around the risks of doing so. Understanding that system helps explain both why so many merchant voyages took place every single year, and what happened, legally and practically, once a ship like this one was found empty at sea, still loaded with a valuable cargo. At the center of that system, by the late 1800s, stood the marine insurance market centered in London, best known by the name Lloyd's. Lloyd's began more than a century and a half earlier as a coffee house on a busy London street where ship captains, merchants, and underwriters gathered to trade shipping news and arrange insurance against the very real risk of losing a vessel and its cargo to storms, fire, piracy, or simple misfortune. By the time the Mary Celeste made her final voyage, this kind of insurance was a routine part of ocean trade on both sides of the Atlantic, and a ship's owners typically insured both the vessel itself and the value of whatever cargo she carried, sometimes through several different underwriters sharing the risk. This is worth knowing, because it explains why an abandoned but intact ship, still loaded with valuable cargo, was never simply left to drift wherever the currents happened to carry her. She represented real money, owed to real people and companies, and her recovery mattered enormously to ship owners and underwriters alike, who had every financial incentive to see her brought safely to port. This financial reality gave rise to a body of maritime law, refined over generations of practice and court decisions, known as the law of salvage. In simple terms, if a sailor came across a ship at sea that had been abandoned, with no reasonable hope that her owner or crew intended to return and reclaim her, that sailor had the legal right to bring the vessel to a safe port and claim a financial reward for doing so. The reward did not transfer ownership of the ship itself. It compensated the salvor for the real risk, skill, and effort involved in recovering property that would otherwise almost certainly have been lost to the sea. This is precisely the situation David Morehouse and his crew found themselves in when they boarded the drifting Mary Celeste roughly a week before Christmas. After deciding the ship was sound enough to sail safely, Morehouse divided his own crew, sending a small prize crew of 2 men aboard the Mary Celeste while the remainder stayed with the Dei Gratia, and the 2 vessels sailed together to Gibraltar, the nearest port with the legal authority to hear salvage claims involving British and American ships and cargo. What followed was a formal maritime inquiry, the kind of proceeding that produced much of what we actually know about the case today, and one that stretched on for weeks longer than anyone involved had expected. A Vice Admiralty court examined the ship in detail, questioned witnesses from both vessels, and weighed the available evidence, including, notably, a fair amount of unfounded suspicion directed at Morehouse and his crew themselves, since a substantial salvage reward gave them an obvious financial motive that the court's Advocate General felt obligated to investigate thoroughly before ruling it out. Some in Gibraltar even floated theories, never substantiated, that Morehouse and Briggs had conspired together for insurance purposes, a suggestion that made little practical sense given that Briggs himself, along with his entire family, had vanished along with the crew. In the end, no credible evidence of wrongdoing on anyone's part was found, and the court eventually awarded the Dei Gratia's crew a salvage payment, though a considerably smaller one than they had hoped for, reflecting the court's own lingering unease about a case that no one could fully explain to everyone's satisfaction. This legal and financial machinery, insurance, salvage law, and formal admiralty hearings, was not unique to the Mary Celeste. It applied to the ordinary, everyday business of ocean shipping in general, and it is part of why so many ships cross the Atlantic and other oceans every year in this period without their stories ever becoming known outside their own ports. A successful voyage, delivering cargo intact and on schedule, earned money for owners, captains, and often crew members through modest bonuses tied to a safe and timely arrival. An unsuccessful one, whether from storm damage, grounding, or outright loss, triggered a claims process that could take months to resolve, and that depended heavily on accurate, honest reporting from captains and crew, filed the moment a ship reached her next port. This is one reason logbooks were kept so carefully and consistently, hour by hour, watch by watch, throughout every voyage. Briggs's own log, recovered from the Mary Celeste and carefully studied by investigators in Gibraltar, was a key piece of evidence in reconstructing the ship's final days. precisely because captains of his generation understood that an accurate, honestly kept record protected both their professional reputation and their family's livelihood. Trade routes themselves were shaped by what different regions produced and what they needed from elsewhere. A pattern of exchange stretching back centuries, but accelerating enormously during the industrial 19th century. New York by the 1870s was one of the busiest ports in the world, a hub for American cotton, grain, and manufactured goods heading to Europe, and for European finished goods, wine, and manufactured products heading back across the Atlantic. Industrial alcohol, the Mary Celeste's particular cargo, was in steady demand in Italy for use in manufacturing and in fortifying and preserving wine during production. A reminder that even an unglamorous, purely industrial cargo represented a specific, ordinary economic need on the other side of the ocean. Ships like the Mary Celeste were, in this sense, the freight trucks of their era, considerably less romantic in day-to-day purpose than popular legend often suggests, but genuinely essential to how the growing industrial economies of the 19th century actually functioned and connected to one another. It is worth pausing on how differently this legal and financial system treated a ship, depending on the precise details of how she was found. A vessel discovered on fire or breaking apart on rocks was typically declared a total loss, her insured value paid out directly to the owner, and the physical wreck left to the sea with little further legal interest from anyone. A vessel like the Mary Celeste, found intact, undamaged, and still under sail, was something considerably rarer and more valuable under maritime law. A nearly complete asset waiting only for someone willing to take on the real risk of boarding and sailing her safely home. This distinction between a wreck and a derelict mattered enormously in Admiralty courts, and it is exactly why the Mary Celeste story did not end with her discovery in December 1872. It continued through a lengthy courtroom proceeding in Gibraltar, through eventual insurance settlements for the missing crew's families, and through the ship's own return to ordinary commercial service under new owners and captains. A service that, by an odd and rather sad twist of history, continued for more than a decade afterward, under a persistent cloud of bad luck and superstition among sailors, many of whom came to view the Mary Celeste as an unlucky vessel that no amount of honest work could ever quite redeem. The Salvage Award itself, when it finally came, illustrates just how cautious the court remained even after months of investigation. Salvage payments in this period could reach as much as half the value of a recovered ship and cargo in cases involving genuine danger and skill on the part of the salver. The DEI Gratia's crew, despite the very real risk they had taken in sailing an unfamiliar, undermanned vessel across hundreds of miles of open ocean, ultimately received only about 1/5 of the Mary Celeste's assessed value, a comparatively modest sum that many maritime historians since have read as the court's way of expressing continued, unresolved suspicion without ever being able to point to actual proof of wrongdoing. Morehouse and his men left Gibraltar with their reward and their reputations intact, but also with the quiet knowledge that they would likely be associated with an unsolved mystery for the rest of their working lives. Behind this individual case sat a much larger, well-established framework of international shipping law and registry that made a hearing like this possible at all. By the 1870s, both American and British vessels operated under national registry systems that recorded a ship's ownership, tonnage, and home port, records that let a court in Gibraltar quickly confirm the Mary Celeste's American registration and trace her ownership back to her part owners in Massachusetts and New York. Treaties and shared maritime customs between trading nations, refined over generations of prior disputes, allowed a British court to hear a case involving an American vessel and an American crew with reasonable confidence that its rulings would be respected on both sides of the Atlantic. This international cooperation, unglamorous as it sounds, was every bit as essential to 19th century ocean trade as any sextant or sail, since a shipping industry that could not resolve disputes over abandoned or damaged vessels across national lines would have struggled to attract the investment that let merchants build and insure ships like the Mary Celeste in the first place. This system of trade, insurance, and salvage law connected ships, ports, and courts across the Atlantic world into something like a single, functioning network of information and obligation. It is the reason we know as much as we do today about a ship abandoned in the middle of an ocean a century and a half ago, and it is the backdrop against which every other case in tonight's story took place. Whether the vessel in question was a wooden brigantine off the Azores or, as we will see later, a steel cargo steamer trapped in Arctic ice thousands of miles to the north. Every decision made aboard a ship like the Mary Celeste depended on a small set of tools, most of them simple by modern standards, but genuinely essential to keeping a vessel and her crew alive, far from land. Understanding these tools helps explain both how sailors managed the ordinary demands of a voyage and how the failure of even one of them, as we saw with the ship's pump, could tip a careful captain toward a decision he might never otherwise have made. Navigation, first of all, depended on instruments that had changed relatively little in their basic principles for several generations. A magnetic compass, mounted where the helmsman could see it clearly, gave a ship's heading at any moment. A sextant, used together with an accurate marine chronometer, kept carefully wound and checked against a known reference time, let a navigator measure the angle of the sun or particular stars above the horizon and calculate the ship's latitude and, with careful timekeeping, her longitude as well. This method, known as celestial navigation, required clear skies, a steady hand, and considerable practiced skill, and it meant that a run of storms and heavy overcast, exactly the conditions the Mary Celeste faced during her final 2 weeks at sea, could leave even an experienced captain genuinely uncertain of his ship's precise position for days at a time. Briggs's last logged position, already several days old by the time the DEI Gracia found the ship, reflects this reality plainly. A captain sailing through doubtful weather often had to rely instead on dead reckoning, estimating his position from known speed, compass heading, and elapsed time since the last confirmed fix, a method that worked reasonably well in practice but accumulated small, compounding errors the longer a ship went without a clear celestial reading to correct them. The ship's pump, was a far less glamorous instrument, but arguably just as important to a crew's sense of safety. Wooden hulls flexed and worked constantly in heavy seas, opening tiny gaps between planks, and some amount of water finding its way into the bilge, the lowest part of the hull beneath the cargo, was entirely normal and expected on any wooden vessel. A functioning pump let the crew measure and remove that water on a regular schedule, keeping a clear, reassuring sense of exactly how much the ship was actually taking on at any given time. When a pump became clogged or unreliable, as investigators believed happened aboard the Mary Celeste due to debris left over from an earlier cargo of coal on a previous voyage, a crew lost their single most direct, trustworthy way of confirming whether their situation was genuinely dangerous or simply uncomfortable and routine. In the absence of that concrete information, fear tends to fill the gap left behind, and fear, as we saw clearly in Chapter 1, can end up being every bit as dangerous as the storm itself. Lifeboats, or ship's boats as they were more commonly called in this period, represented the tool of last resort, and the fact that a ship's boat was found missing from a discovered derelict, as it was aboard both the Mary Celeste and, decades later, a very different vessel called the Carol A. Deering is one of the clearest signs available to investigators that a crew left their ship deliberately, rather than being swept overboard or overcome suddenly where they stood on deck. A ship's boat in this period was typically a simple open craft, rowed rather than powered by sail or engine, stocked if time and circumstances allowed with a small emergency store of food, water, and basic navigation tools. It offered a genuinely slim chance of survival on a calm day within reach of established shipping lanes or nearby land, and a far slimmer chance still in rough weather on the opened Atlantic in late autumn, which is almost certainly why the 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste, once separated from their ship, were never seen or heard from again by anyone. Beyond navigation and emergency equipment, a working ship depended on an entire toolkit of more ordinary, everyday skills and objects, the kind that rarely made it into official records, but shaped every single day at sea. Sailors needed to know how to splice and repair rope by hand, patch canvas sails torn by sudden wind, caulk seams in the hull with tar and fiber to keep water out, and maintain both the standing rigging which held the masts upright and the running rigging which actually let the crew adjust the sails to catch and use the wind efficiently. These were not specialist trades performed by a handful of experts brought aboard for the purpose. They were baseline competencies expected of any able seaman, learned gradually through years of hard apprenticeship at sea rather than in any classroom ashore. A sailor's own sea chest often held his personal set of basic tools for this constant work: a sailmaker's needle and palm for heavy stitching, a marline spike for working and splicing rope, and a reliable knife, usually his most valued and carefully maintained possession. Food preservation was its own quiet, essential skill, practiced daily by whoever served as the ship's cook or steward. Salting meat, drying peas and beans, and packing hard biscuit in ways that kept out moisture and pests were techniques refined over centuries of long ocean voyages. and a ship's steward bore real, practical responsibility for making limited stores last the full length of a crossing without spoiling in the damp conditions below decks. On a well-provisioned ship like the Mary Celeste, this meant that even after a delayed and genuinely difficult voyage, roughly 6 months of food and water remained aboard, untouched, when she was found drifting near the Azores, a quiet, almost domestic testament to careful planning that had nothing whatsoever to do with whatever ultimately went wrong that November. Clothing and bedding, too, reflected the practical, unglamorous demands of the work itself. Sailors dressed in heavy wool and oiled canvas to work in wet, cold conditions for hours at a stretch, layering garments that could be added or removed as weather shifted through the course of a single watch. Below deck, in the officers' quarters, bedding was often built directly into the wall itself, a fixed berth rather than a hanging or freestanding bed, specifically designed to keep a sleeping person from being thrown across the cabin during rough seas. A small but genuinely telling adaptation to a world that never fully stopped moving, day or night, for the entire length of a voyage. Communication between ships, in an era long before radio, depended on an entirely visual language that every officer had to know by heart. A standardized set of signal flags, each combination representing a specific letter, number, or prearranged message, let two vessels within sight of one another exchange basic information: a request for the time, a report of damage, a warning of ice or wreckage ahead. This system worked only within visual range and only in daylight or clear conditions, which meant that for most of any ocean crossing, a ship was entirely cut off from any outside contact at all, dependent entirely on her own crew and her own limited stores to handle whatever arose. This isolation is worth sitting with for a moment, since it shapes so much of why decisions made aboard ships like the Mary Celeste could not simply be checked or confirmed with anyone else. Once Briggs decided the situation below decks was dangerous, there was no one to call, no authority to consult, and no way to learn that ships just like his had faced the same alarming combination of vapor and uncertain pumps before, without ever actually sinking. Basic medical care aboard a merchant vessel was similarly self-contained and similarly limited. Few ships of the Mary Celeste's modest size carried a trained physician, and responsibility for treating injuries or illness typically fell to the captain or an experienced mate, working from a basic medicine chest stocked with items like quinine, laudanum for pain, and simple supplies for cleaning and binding wounds. Sailors relied heavily on practical experience passed down from more senior crew members, since a badly infected injury or a serious illness contracted far from land offered few good options beyond careful nursing and time. This reality shaped decisions in ways easy to overlook today. A captain weighing whether to risk the open boat against the uncertain safety of his own ship was also, whether he fully articulated it or not, weighing the fact that if anyone aboard were badly hurt in the hours ahead, there would be no way to summon outside help regardless of which choice he made. None of these individual tools or skills were remarkable on their own. They were the ordinary equipment of ordinary maritime work, present in roughly this same form aboard thousands of ships crossing the world's oceans every single year during this period. What made the Mary Celeste's case genuinely unusual was not any single tool or its absence, but the way two small, entirely mundane failures, a fouled pump and a hold full of restless, invisible vapor, combined during a stretch of genuinely difficult weather to produce a decision that once made could never be undone. It is a pattern worth remembering as we turn next to the daily rhythm of life aboard a ship like this one, a rhythm built almost entirely around the careful, repeated use of exactly these instruments and exactly these hard-won skills. Every decision made aboard a ship like the Mary Celeste depended on a small set of tools, most of them simple by modern standards, but genuinely essential to keeping a vessel and her crew alive far from land. Understanding these tools helps explain both how sailors managed the ordinary demands of a voyage and how the failure of even one of them, as we saw with the ship's pump, could tip a careful captain toward a decision he might never otherwise have made. Navigation, first of all, depended on instruments that had changed relatively little in their basic principles for several generations. A magnetic compass, mounted where the helmsman could see it clearly, gave a ship's heading at any moment. A sextant, used together with an accurate marine chronometer kept carefully wound and checked against a known reference time, let a navigator measure the angle of the sun or particular stars above the horizon and calculate the ship's latitude, and, with careful timekeeping, her longitude as well. This method, known as celestial navigation, required clear skies, a steady hand, and considerable practiced skill, and it meant that a run of storms and heavy overcast, exactly the conditions the Mary Celeste faced during her final 2 weeks at sea, could leave even an experienced captain genuinely uncertain of his ship's precise position for days at a time. Briggs's last logged position, already several days old by the time the DEI Gratia found the ship, reflects this reality plainly. A captain sailing through doubtful weather often had to rely instead on dead reckoning, estimating his position from known speed, compass heading, and elapsed time since the last confirmed fix, a method that worked reasonably well in practice but accumulated small, compounding errors the longer a ship went without a clear celestial reading to correct them. The ship's pump was a far less glamorous instrument, but arguably just as important to a crew's sense of safety. Wooden hulls flexed and worked constantly in heavy seas, opening tiny gaps between planks, and some amount of water finding its way into the bilge, the lowest part of the hull beneath the cargo, was entirely normal and expected on any wooden vessel. A functioning pump let the crew measure and remove that water on a regular schedule, keeping a clear, reassuring sense of exactly how much the ship was actually taking on at any given time. When a pump became clogged or unreliable, as investigators believed happened aboard the Mary Celeste due to debris left over from an earlier cargo of coal on a previous voyage, a crew lost their single most direct, trustworthy way of confirming whether their situation was genuinely dangerous or simply uncomfortable and routine. In the absence of that concrete information, fear tends to fill the gap left behind, and fear, as we saw clearly in Chapter 1, can end up being every bit as dangerous as the storm itself. Lifeboats, or ship's boats as they were more commonly called in this period, represented the tool of last resort, and the fact that a ship's boat was found missing from a discovered derelict, as it was aboard both the Mary Celeste and, decades later, a very different vessel called the Carroll A. Deering is one of the clearest signs available to investigators that a crew left their ship deliberately, rather than being swept overboard or overcome suddenly where they stood on deck. A ship's boat in this period was typically a simple open craft, rowed rather than powered by sail or engine, stocked if time and circumstances allowed with a small emergency store of food, water, and basic navigation tools. It offered a genuinely slim chance of survival on a calm day within reach of established shipping lanes or nearby land, and a far slimmer chance still in rough weather on the opened Atlantic in late autumn, which is almost certainly why the 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste, once separated from their ship, were never seen or heard from again by anyone. Beyond navigation and emergency equipment, a working ship depended on an entire toolkit of more ordinary, everyday skills and objects, the kind that rarely made it into official records, but shaped every single day at sea. Sailors needed to know how to splice and repair rope by hand, patch canvas sails torn by sudden wind, caulk seams in the hull with tar and fiber to keep water out, and maintain both the standing rigging which held the masts upright and the running rigging which actually let the crew adjust the sails to catch and use the wind efficiently. These were not specialist trades performed by a handful of experts brought aboard for the purpose. They were baseline competencies expected of any able seaman, learned gradually through years of hard apprenticeship at sea rather than in any classroom ashore. A sailor's own sea chest often held his personal set of basic tools for this constant work. A sailmaker's needle and palm for heavy stitching, a marlin spike for working and splicing rope, and a reliable knife, usually his most valued and carefully maintained possession. Food preservation was its own quiet, essential skill, practiced daily by whoever served as the ship's cook or steward. Salting meat, drying peas and beans, and packing hard biscuit in ways that kept out moisture and pests were techniques refined over centuries of long ocean voyages, and a ship's steward bore real, practical responsibility for making limited stores last the full length of a crossing without spoiling in the damp conditions below decks. On a well-provisioned ship like the Mary Celeste, this meant that even after a delayed and genuinely difficult voyage, roughly 6 months of food and water remained aboard, untouched, when she was found drifting near the Azores, a quiet, almost domestic testament to careful planning that had nothing whatsoever to do with whatever ultimately went wrong that November. Clothing and bedding, too, reflected the practical, unglamorous demands of the work itself. Sailors dressed in heavy wool and oiled canvas to work in wet, cold conditions for hours at a stretch, layering garments that could be added or removed as weather shifted through the course of a single watch. Below deck, in the officers' quarters, bedding was often built directly into the wall itself, a fixed berth rather than a hanging or freestanding bed, specifically designed to keep a sleeping person from being thrown across the cabin during rough seas. a small but genuinely telling adaptation to a world that never fully stopped moving, day or night, for the entire length of a voyage. Communication between ships in an era long before radio depended on an entirely visual language that every officer had to know by heart. A standardized set of signal flags, each combination representing a specific letter, number, or prearranged message, let two vessels within sight of one another exchange basic information: a request for the time, a report of damage, a warning of ice or wreckage ahead. This system worked only within visual range and only in daylight or clear conditions, which meant that for most of any ocean crossing, a ship was entirely cut off from any outside contact at all, dependent entirely on her own crew and her own limited stores to handle whatever arose. This isolation is worth sitting with for a moment, since it shapes so much of why decisions made aboard ships like the Mary Celeste could not simply be checked or confirmed with anyone else. Once Briggs decided the situation below decks was dangerous, there was no one to call, no authority to consult, and no way to learn that ships just like his had faced the same alarming combination of vapor and uncertain pumps before, without ever actually sinking. Basic medical care aboard a merchant vessel was similarly self-contained and similarly limited. Few ships of the Mary Celeste's modest size carried a trained physician, and responsibility for treating injuries or illness typically fell to the captain or an experienced mate, working from a basic medicine chest stocked with items like quinine, laudanum for pain, and simple supplies for cleaning and binding wounds. Sailors relied heavily on practical experience passed down from more senior crew members, since a badly infected injury or a serious illness contracted far from land offered few good options beyond careful nursing and time. This reality shaped decisions in ways easy to overlook today. A captain weighing whether to risk the open boat against the uncertain safety of his own ship was also, whether he fully articulated it or not, weighing the fact that if anyone aboard were badly hurt in the hours ahead, there would be no way to summon outside help, regardless of which choice he made. None of these individual tools or skills were remarkable on their own. They were the ordinary equipment of ordinary maritime work, present in roughly this same form aboard thousands of ships crossing the world's oceans every single year during this period. What made the Mary Celeste's case genuinely unusual was not any single tool or its absence, but the way two small, entirely mundane failures, a fouled pump and a hold full of restless, invisible vapor, combined during a stretch of genuinely difficult weather to produce a decision that, once made, could never be undone. It is a pattern worth remembering as we turn next to the daily rhythm of life aboard a ship like this one, a rhythm built almost entirely around the careful, repeated use of exactly these instruments and exactly these hard-won skills. For every person aboard a merchant sailing ship, whether captain, officer, or ordinary seaman, life at sea followed a structure built around the watch system, a method of dividing the 24-hour day into shifts so that the ship was always, at every single hour, in someone's capable hands. On most merchant vessels of this period, the crew was divided into two watches, commonly called port and starboard, each responsible for handling the ship for a set block of hours before being relieved by the other group. A typical arrangement split the day into 4-hour watches, with one shorter pair of 2-hour watches, known as the dog watches, worked into the late afternoon and early evening, specifically so that the rotation would not fall on the same men at the same hours every single day of the voyage. This small adjustment mattered more than it might first seem. Standing the middle of the night watch from midnight to 4 in the morning was widely considered the hardest and loneliest stretch of the entire rotation, and the dog watch system meant that no single group of sailors was condemned to that particular shift indefinitely for the length of a long voyage. A sailor coming off watch might have roughly 4 hours to sleep, eat, mend clothing, or simply rest quietly before being called again for his next turn, and this pattern repeated day after day, night after night, for the entire length of a voyage, whether that voyage lasted a few weeks or several months at a stretch. It gave shipboard life a steady, almost monastic rhythm, one built less around any clock on the wall, which few ordinary sailors owned or particularly needed, and more around the ship's bell, struck every half-hour throughout each watch to mark the passage of time clearly for everyone aboard, officers and crew alike. Morning aboard ship often began with washing down and scrubbing the deck, a task performed using a soft sandstone block that sailors called a holystone, worked back and forth across the wooden planking on hands and knees. The name is said to come from the small size of the stone, roughly that of a prayer book, and from the humble, kneeling posture the work required of the men doing it. Beyond simple appearance, scrubbing the deck this way served a genuinely practical purpose, removing salt residue and grime that could otherwise make footing dangerously treacherous in wet weather and, over time, contribute to slow rot in the ship's wooden planking if left unattended. Meals punctuated the day and were, by most surviving accounts from this era, simple and repetitive rather than varied or in any way indulgent. Breakfast typically consisted of hard ship's biscuit, sometimes softened by soaking in coffee or tea, alongside whatever salted meat or thin porridge the ship's limited stores allowed on a given morning. The midday meal was usually the largest of the day, again built around salted beef or pork, dried peas or beans, and more of the same hard biscuit, prepared by a designated cook or steward working in a small, often smoky galley that had to function safely even as the entire ship pitched and rolled beneath the cooking fire. Fresh food, when available at all, tended to appear only in the earliest days of a voyage, before perishable stores were fully exhausted, which meant that a long crossing like the Mary Celeste's gradually shifted toward an entirely preserved diet as the weeks at sea went on and fresh provisions ran out. Between watches, meals, and sleep, there was rarely true idleness for anyone aboard a working ship. Sailors mended torn sails, tarred and inspected rigging, coiled and recoiled loose rope, and performed the ceaseless small maintenance that kept a wooden ship functional against the constant wear of salt water, wind, and motion. Officers, meanwhile, carried their own steady, ongoing responsibilities, recording the ship's position, speed, and weather conditions in the logbook at regular intervals throughout each watch, calculating the ship's course forward and, in the captain's case, weighing every decision about sail, heading, and overall safety against the ship's cargo, her schedule, and the ever-present uncertainty of the weather ahead. For a captain who had brought his family aboard, as Briggs had, this daily rhythm took on an additional, quieter dimension entirely his own. Surviving accounts of the Mary Celeste's cabin describe small domestic touches, a sewing machine, a folding organ, children's things tucked into corners, that suggest ordinary family life continued as much as it reasonably could within the confined wooden walls of a working cargo ship. A young child aboard, like 2-year-old Sophia, would have grown up for the length of this voyage inside this same rhythm of bells, watches, and the constant motion of the sea. A small world entirely her own, bounded by wooden rails and canvas sails, strikingly different from a childhood spent entirely on land. Night watches carried their own particular character and their own particular demands. In clear weather, sailors on the night watch navigated largely by starlight and the faint glow of the ship's compass lamp, listening carefully for changes in the sound of wind and water that might signal an approaching squall long before it could actually be seen in the darkness. In poor weather, the same watch became considerably more demanding, requiring constant, careful attention to sail trim and steering in conditions that offered little visibility and even less certainty about what lay just ahead. It was precisely this kind of demanding, poorly visible night work, sustained across nearly 2 full weeks of storms, that would have left Briggs and his small crew increasingly exhausted by the time the Mary Celeste reached her final recorded position near the Azores, an exhaustion very likely woven directly into whatever decision was ultimately made aboard her in those final hours. Sundays, where a voyage's schedule allowed for them, brought a small but genuine change to the week's rhythm. On many merchant vessels, Sunday meant a lighter workload, a general inspection of the crew and their quarters, and sometimes a simple religious service led by the captain himself, since a dedicated chaplain was a luxury reserved mostly for larger naval vessels rather than modest merchant ships. Briggs, described by those who knew him as a genuinely devout Christian man who did not drink, would very likely have observed some version of this quieter Sunday routine aboard the Mary Celeste, a small, recurring marker of ordinary time passing even in the middle of an ocean that offered no other calendar at all. Off-watch hours, limited as they were, still left room for a kind of modest leisure that helped sailors endure the genuine monotony of a long crossing. Storytelling, singing, and simple games of cards or dice were common ways to pass idle time below deck, and many ships developed their own working songs called shanties, sung in rhythm to coordinate physical tasks like hauling on a line or raising an anchor, the song's beat helping a scattered group of tired men pull together at exactly the same moment. These songs served a practical purpose as much as an entertaining one, but they also offered a rare outlet for a crew whose days otherwise consisted almost entirely of repetitive, closely supervised labor. Discipline aboard a merchant vessel like the Mary Celeste was generally less severe than the formal, often brutal punishments still used aboard naval ships of the same period, but it remained real and, when necessary, could be firm. A captain held broad legal authority over his crew for the length of a voyage, and serious insubordination or dangerous negligence could be met with real consequences. Though most day-to-day discipline relied more on a captain's personal authority and a crew's practical understanding that a poorly run ship put everyone's safety at risk. Briggs's reputation as fair and even-tempered, noted by nearly everyone who had sailed under him before, likely made the Mary Celeste a calmer ship in this respect than many others of her era, which makes the eventual outcome of her final voyage feel, if anything, even more tragic in hindsight. Weather reading itself was less a single skill than a whole accumulated body of half-conscious knowledge built up over years and passed from older sailors to younger ones almost entirely through observation rather than instruction. A change in the color of the sky at sunset, a particular pattern of high, thin cloud, a shift in the feel of the wind against bare skin, all carried meaning to an experienced sailor that a passenger standing on the same deck would never notice at all. This kind of knowledge could not be written down in any complete way, which is part of why the loss of an experienced crew, as happened aboard both the Mary Celeste and the Carroll A. Deering, represented a loss of expertise that no logbook could fully replace. A young apprentice sailing his first Atlantic crossing depended enormously on absorbing this knowledge quickly, since a ship far from land offered no real substitute for a captain's practiced eye. Seasonal rhythms shaped a sailor's expectations for any given voyage almost as much as the watch bell shaped his individual day. Late autumn crossings of the North Atlantic, like the Mary Celeste's, carried a well-known reputation among experienced captains for sudden, violent weather, a reputation borne out by insurance records of the period, which show elevated losses on ships sailing this route in November and December compared with calmer summer months. A captain setting out at this time of year accepted a higher level of ordinary risk as simply part of the job, planning his provisions and his own expectations accordingly, in a way that made the string of storms battering the Mary Celeste unwelcome, certainly, but never entirely unexpected. This daily structure, the 4-hour watches, the holystone decks, the repetitive but reliable meals, the ceaseless small maintenance work, gave real shape and predictability to a working life that could otherwise feel entirely at the mercy of the ocean's changing moods. It is worth holding on to this picture of ordinary, steadily repeated routine as we turn now to look more closely at how differently that same basic routine could feel depending on who a sailor actually was, what rank he held aboard ship, and where and when he happened to be working. It would be a mistake to imagine 19th century maritime life as a single uniform experience shared equally by everyone who happened to go to sea. A captain's life aboard ship differed enormously from that of an ordinary seaman, and both differed again considerably depending on the region, the historical era, and the particular kind of vessel involved. Rank shaped almost everything about daily experience aboard any working ship. A captain like Benjamin Briggs held not just formal authority, but a real measure of comfort unavailable to the rest of his crew. a private cabin, often furnished with modest domestic touches, and in some cases, as we have already seen, room enough to bring along a wife and young child for the voyage. First and second mates occupied a middle position within this hierarchy, still enjoying somewhat better quarters and food than the ordinary crew, while carrying heavy, exacting responsibility for the technical work of navigation and day-to-day ship handling. Able seamen and ordinary seamen, who together made up the largest part of any crew, lived forward in the cramped shared forecastle, ate the plainest available rations, and did the heaviest and most physically dangerous labor aboard, climbing high into the rigging in all kinds of weather, a task that carried genuine, well-documented risk of serious injury or death from a single bad fall. Pay reflected this same rigid hierarchy in fairly direct terms. Wages for ordinary sailors in this period were generally modest, and life at sea for many young men was as much a matter of plain economic necessity as it was of adventure or family tradition. Sailors came from a wide range of backgrounds, some following family trades that stretched back several generations, others turning to the sea simply because it offered steady, if genuinely hard employment at a time when other opportunities ashore were scarce. On the Mary Celeste specifically, several of the crew were experienced sailors from the Frisian Islands off the coast of northern Germany and the Netherlands, a region with a long and respected tradition of supplying skilled seamen to merchant fleets across the Atlantic world, a reminder that a single ship's crew often represented several different nations and overlapping maritime traditions, all working side by side within the same small wooden hull. Geography mattered just as much as rank in shaping a sailor's actual working life. A voyage across the open Atlantic, like the Mary Celeste's run toward Genoa, differed sharply in character from coastal trade routes that hugged the eastern seaboard of the United States, where ships like the schooner Carroll A. Deering, whom we will meet properly in the next chapter, moved cargo steadily between American ports and destinations in the Caribbean and South America. Coastal waters brought their own distinct dangers, shifting sandbars, unpredictable local currents, and, off the coast of North Carolina in particular, a notoriously treacherous stretch of shoals that earned the grim regional nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic, long before the Deering herself ever sailed anywhere near it. Farther north and west, an entirely different maritime world existed within the Arctic supply trade, one we will explore in real detail shortly through the story of a steel cargo steamer called the Bedtime. Ships working the northern coasts of Alaska and Canada in the early 20th century faced ice rather than open ocean storms as their primary adversary, operated on a distinctly seasonal rather than continuous schedule dictated by the freeze and thaw of Arctic waters, and depended on ongoing trading relationships with Inuit communities along the coast in ways that had no real equivalent whatsoever on the opened Atlantic. A sailor who spent his working career on these Arctic supply runs experienced an almost entirely different profession from one who regularly crossed between New York and the Mediterranean, even though both men might have accurately, honestly described themselves simply as merchant sailors. Time itself created real, meaningful differences within this broader maritime world as well. The wooden, wind-powered ships of the Mary Celeste's era were already, by the final decades of the 19th century, beginning to give way gradually to iron and steel vessels driven by steam power, though this transition happened unevenly across different trades and different regions. By the time the Bejimo made her final working voyages in the early 1930s, she was a steel-hulled steamer, an entirely different kind of ship in almost every respect, considerably more resistant to the kind of catastrophic damage that wood and canvas vessels always had to fear, and, as her own genuinely strange later history would go on to prove, remarkably difficult to destroy outright, even when deliberately abandoned by her own crew as a lost and hopeless cause. It is worth resisting, too, any easy temptation to imagine sailors of this general era as uniformly superstitious, or alternatively, as uniformly coldly rational in their thinking. Belief in maritime omens, unlucky ships, and enduring legends like the Flying Dutchman, which we will examine directly in the final chapter, existed comfortably alongside careful, highly practical seamanship, often within the very same experienced person. A working captain could hold genuine, hard-won expertise in navigation and ship handling, while also carrying real, honest anxiety about a supposedly cursed voyage or an ill-omened cargo, particularly after weeks of exhausting, poorly visible storms of exactly the kind that battered the Mary Celeste so relentlessly. These were not contradictions so much as two entirely different human responses to the very same enormous, ever-present uncertainty every sailor of this era faced: the plain, unavoidable fact that the ocean did not much care how skilled or careful anyone aboard happened to be on any given day. Age created its own quiet hierarchy aboard ship, separate from rank but closely tied to it. Many crews included at least one boy or young apprentice, sometimes no older than 12 or 13, sent to sea to learn the trade from the ground up, typically starting with the least skilled and most physically demanding chores aboard. These young apprentices occupied a distinct position, neither fully part of the officer class nor quite treated as equals to the veteran able seamen they worked alongside, and their presence reflected a broader reality of the period in which a career at sea often began remarkably young and was learned entirely through direct, hands-on experience rather than any formal schooling. A veteran able seaman in his 30s or 40s, by contrast, commanded real respect among his peers for accumulated skill and endurance, even without holding any formal rank above ordinary crew, and younger sailors typically looked to these older hands for practical guidance that no manual could fully replace. The kind of ship itself, beyond simple cargo versus passenger distinctions, also shaped daily life considerably. A large, well-funded transatlantic passenger liner of this same general period offered passengers, and to some extent crew, considerably more comfort than a modest two-masted brigantine like the Mary Celeste, with better food, more spacious quarters, and often a ship's doctor aboard full-time. A small merchant brigantine, by contrast, operated on tighter margins throughout, her owners weighing every additional expense against the narrow profit a single cargo run might realistically produce. This economic reality meant that ships like the Mary Celeste were, in a very real sense, built and provisioned as efficiently as safety allowed, a fact reflected in her modest crew of only 8 adults tasked with managing every aspect of a substantial ocean-going vessel, considerably fewer hands than a larger vessel of similar tonnage might have carried. Ownership itself created another layer of difference, separate from the crew entirely, but shaping their working conditions in real ways. Some ships, like the Mary Celeste, were owned in shares by a small group of investors, often including the captain himself, who held a direct financial stake in the vessel's safe and profitable operation. Other ships were owned outright by larger shipping companies or wealthy individual merchants who might never once set foot aboard, and whose interest in any particular voyage began and ended with its balance sheet. Sailors and officers alike understood, in practical terms, which kind of ownership they were working under, since a captain with his own money invested in the ship's success tended to run a noticeably different vessel than one simply drawing a fixed salary from a distant owner focused purely on cost. Regional maritime cultures, too, carried their own distinct character, shaped by generations of local tradition. New England's shipbuilding towns, including Briggs's own home region in Massachusetts, had produced sea captains for generations, an inherited trade passed from father to son within tightly knit coastal communities where nearly every family had some connection to the sea. The Frisian sailors aboard the Mary Celeste came from an entirely different, equally deep regional tradition along the North Sea coast, one shaped by centuries of fishing, trading, and land reclaimed from the water itself. Neither tradition was more authentic or more skilled than the other, but each carried its own particular customs, its own superstitions, and its own unspoken expectations about how a ship ought to be run, all of which had to somehow function together within the cramped, shared quarters of a single working vessel. Taken together, these real differences of rank, region, historical era, age, ship type, and ownership complicate any simple, flattened picture of what it actually meant to be a working sailor in this period. The lived experience of being aboard an abandoned or lost ship, and the underlying reasons a crew might have chosen to abandon her in the first place, varied considerably depending on all of these interlocking factors, a reality the next chapter will make especially clear as we turn now from the opened Atlantic toward the shallow, genuinely dangerous waters off Cape Hatteras. Not every abandoned ship that entered maritime legend gave up its secrets as clearly or as completely as the Mary Celeste eventually did. In January 1921, nearly 50 years after Briggs's brigantine was found drifting quietly near the Azores, a very different vessel ran hard aground off the coast of North Carolina, and her story shows how ordinary dangers, violent storms, treacherous coastlines, and simple human error could combine to produce a mystery that has genuinely never been fully resolved, even after a full century of investigation. The Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted schooner built in Bath, Maine in 1919, one of the last and largest wooden cargo ships constructed anywhere before steel hulls became the industry standard for vessels of her size. On the 29th of January 1921, she was sighted clearly by the keeper of a lightship stationed off Cape Lookout, returning north along the American coast after successfully delivering a cargo of coal all the way to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. A crew member aboard the Deering hailed the lightship through a handheld megaphone, reporting that the schooner had lost both her anchors and their heavy chains in a recent storm off Cape Fear, and specifically asking that her owners back in Maine be notified of the loss as soon as possible. The lightship's own radio equipment was unfortunately out of order that day, and the requested message never actually reached its intended destination. 2 days later, at dawn on the 31st of January, a Coast Guardsman standing his own watch at the Cape Hatteras life-saving station spotted the Deering hard aground on the Diamond Shoals, a shifting, notoriously dangerous stretch of underwater sandbars responsible, over several centuries of recorded shipping, for several hundred documented shipwrecks along this single stretch of American coastline. Rough seas and continuing high winds delayed rescuers from actually reaching the grounded wreck for several more frustrating days. When Coast Guard crews finally managed to board her on the 4th of February, they found the schooner completely deserted, her sails still fully set as if ready to catch wind at any moment, food sitting prepared and waiting in the galley, coffee and soup on the stove, but not a single person left anywhere aboard, and both of her lifeboats entirely missing from their davits. Unlike the Mary Celeste, whose captain's careful, detailed log survived intact to help investigators reconstruct her final days almost hour by hour, the Deering's navigational charts, papers, and log had all vanished completely along with her crew, leaving considerably less hard physical evidence behind for investigators to work with. This significant gap in the record fueled decades of ongoing speculation, ranging from outright piracy and mutiny to rum running gone badly wrong during the difficult early years of Prohibition, and even, briefly, unfounded rumors involving broader international politics of the period. A message reportedly found sealed inside a bottle washed up on a nearby beach, describing a supposed capture of the ship by pirates, caused a genuine public stir in the national press at the time, though investigators were never able to verify its authenticity through any reliable means, and many historians today consider it likely to have been an unrelated hoax entirely separate from the ship's actual fate. The most straightforward explanation available, offered publicly at the time by an experienced Coast Guard officer who had personally been among the very first to spot the grounded schooner, points back to something far less dramatic than piracy or conspiracy: an ordinary, genuinely terrifying storm. Winds reported as high as 90 miles an hour, combined with mountainous seas and the ship running hard aground on a shifting sandbar in near total darkness, could easily have convinced her captain, a man named Willis Wormel, that the Deering was truly doomed, and that his crew's only real remaining chance lay in the lifeboats, launched directly into exactly the kind of violent churning surf that made small open boats nearly impossible to survive in these particular treacherous waters. Under this straightforward reading, the ship's sudden abandonment followed a pattern strikingly similar to the Mary Celeste's own story decades earlier: a frightened, ultimately fatal decision made under extreme and immediate pressure rather than any deliberate crime committed by anyone. What makes the Deering's case considerably murkier than the Mary Celeste's, though, is that not every surviving detail fits neatly into this otherwise straightforward explanation. Reports from the lightship keeper had already described somewhat unusual, undisciplined behavior among some of the crew in the days leading up to the final grounding, and later investigations suggested real friction and possible serious discipline problems aboard the ship throughout much of her outbound voyage to Brazil. It remains entirely possible that more than one factor was genuinely at work here, ordinary storm danger compounding an already difficult and poorly managed voyage, though a formal federal investigation conducted over the following months, despite considerable sustained effort from multiple government agencies, was ultimately never able to determine conclusively what actually became of Captain Wormel and his crew of 10. This lingering uncertainty is worth sitting with honestly, rather than resolving it artificially for the sake of a tidier story. Historical inquiry does not always produce a single clean answer, no matter how much effort is invested, and the Deering's fate illustrates a genuinely different category of case from the Mary Celeste's. Not a substantially solved mystery with a well-supported, evidence-based explanation, but a case where the most plausible available account, an ordinary maritime disaster amplified considerably by bad luck and poor timing, still leaves real, unfilled gaps that surviving historical records simply cannot close. These two cases together, one substantially explained through careful historical work, the other still genuinely and permanently uncertain, point toward a broader truth about the ordinary dangers sailors of this era regularly faced. Storms were routine, expected hazards of any ocean crossing, but certain stretches of coastline, like the shifting sandbars off Cape Hatteras, concentrated that ordinary danger into something considerably worse, a stretch of coast treacherous enough that sailors of the period had already given it its grim nickname well before the Deering ever attempted to sail through it. Coastal communities along this same dangerous stretch built an entire organized tradition of life-saving stations and dedicated rescue crews, specifically because grounding on these particular shoals was common enough to require professional, organized response rather than isolated, occasional acts of individual heroism. The organization that eventually became the United States Coast Guard, which discovered the Carroll A. Deering grounded on the Diamond Shoals, had grown directly out of an older agency called the United States Life-Saving Service, established specifically because wrecks along dangerous stretches of American coastline were common enough to demand a permanent, trained response rather than relying on nearby residents to organize rescue efforts on their own. Stations along the outer banks of North Carolina, positioned at regular intervals along the coast, kept small crews on constant watch, ready to launch surf boats through dangerous breakers to reach a grounded ship, a job considered among the most physically demanding and genuinely dangerous in American government service at the time. That the Deering was spotted so quickly after grounding, even though rescuers could not safely reach her for several more days, reflects the effectiveness of exactly this kind of organized coastal watch. The specific timing of the Deering's disappearance in January 1921 placed her voyage squarely within the earliest, most chaotic months of Prohibition in the United States, a period when smuggling alcohol along exactly this stretch of Atlantic coastline had already become a serious and growing concern for federal authorities. This context helps explain why theories involving illegal rum running gained real traction in the press at the time, even though investigators were never able to connect the Deering herself to any specific smuggling operation. It is worth noting, all the same, that suspicion alone is not evidence, and the federal investigation that followed, despite pursuing this angle along with several others, found nothing definitive to support it, leaving the storm-driven explanation as the most credible account still available today, incomplete as it remains. It would be easy, telling stories like these, to lean heavily into fear and spectacle for their own sake, but the honest picture that actually emerges from the surviving historical record is considerably quieter, and in its own way sadder than that. Hard-working crews, caught squarely between genuine danger and painfully imperfect information, forced to make consequential decisions under enormous pressure that could never afterward be undone. That is the underlying reality behind most seriously documented ghost ship cases, whatever the more sensational legends that eventually grew up around them over the following decades. Legends we will now look at directly in the final chapter ahead. Long before the Mary Celeste or the Carol A. Deering ever existed, sailors already told stories about ships that could not entirely be trusted, ships that appeared suddenly out of storms or vanished without any real explanation at all. The oldest and by far the most famous of these enduring stories is the legend of the Flying Dutchman, and understanding where that particular tale actually came from helps explain why real, documented cases like the ones in tonight's story were folded so quickly and so thoroughly into a much older tradition of maritime folklore. The earliest surviving written references to the Flying Dutchman date only to the late 18th century, though sailors' own oral traditions describing a phantom ship near the Cape of Good Hope very likely stretch back considerably further still, passed by word of mouth for generations before anyone bothered to write them down. In most surviving versions of the tale, a Dutch sea captain, sailing during the height of the great Dutch maritime trading era, defies a violent storm out of sheer pride or desperation, refusing to turn back even when repeatedly warned of the mounting danger ahead, and is cursed as a direct result, condemned forever to sail the world's oceans without ever making port again. Sighting the ghostly ship itself, according to the legend, was considered a genuinely terrible omen among sailors, a clear sign of disaster to come for anyone unlucky enough to spot her sails on the horizon. The story gained enormous popularity throughout the 19th century, helped along considerably by the composer Richard Wagner's celebrated 1843 opera based directly on the tale, and it has continued shaping popular imagination in one form or another ever since, right up through the present day. What is genuinely worth noticing from a careful historical perspective is how well this particular old legend actually explains a real and fairly common natural phenomenon, the marine mirage. Under certain specific atmospheric conditions, particularly near sharp temperature boundaries over open water, light can bend and refract in ways that make a genuinely distant ship appear to float impossibly above the horizon, distorted, sometimes glowing strangely, or seemingly moving in ways an ordinary vessel simply could not move. Sailors navigating largely without any instruments capable of explaining this particular kind of optical illusion had every reasonable justification to interpret what they saw as something genuinely uncanny, and the story of a doomed captain condemned to sail forever offered a satisfying, memorable, easily shared framework for an experience that otherwise had no easy or obvious explanation available at the time. This same basic human instinct, reaching instinctively for supernatural or dramatic explanations when the real underlying answer was actually something more mundane, shaped how the wider public responded to real, documented cases like the Mary Celeste almost immediately after her initial discovery. Newspaper accounts published in the following years grew steadily more elaborate and imaginative, introducing entirely invented details about the crew's supposed fate that had no real basis whatsoever in the actual investigation or surviving evidence, some involving sea monsters, others involving mutiny or murder, dressed up with considerably more drama than the surviving evidence had ever actually supported. Even the ship's own name shifted slightly in popular retellings over the following decades, from the accurate Mary Celeste to the more theatrical-sounding Marie Celeste, a change with no genuine historical basis whatsoever, but one that stuck firmly enough in popular culture that many people still use the incorrect version today without realizing it. The Carol A. Deering underwent a remarkably similar transformation in the public imagination. Newspapers of the period explicitly and repeatedly compared her to the Flying Dutchman by name, and theories involving international piracy, radical political conspiracy, and secret government cover-ups circulated for years afterward, receiving considerably more sustained public attention from the press than the more plausible, if genuinely less exciting explanation involving an ordinary and simply devastating Atlantic storm striking a poorly managed ship at the worst possible moment. Not every real, documented ghost ship, though, fits neatly into this familiar pattern of a dramatic legend layered on top of a substantially solvable mystery. The story of the SS Bedtime, an Arctic cargo steamer abandoned in October 1931 after becoming hopelessly trapped in shifting pack ice off the northern coast of Alaska, offers something genuinely stranger, precisely because so much of it is straightforwardly, verifiably true. Her crew, reasonably believing the ice-damaged steel hull would soon break apart entirely and sink beneath the pack ice, salvaged what valuable cargo of furs they safely could and left the ship behind, fully expecting never to see her again. Instead, remarkably, the Bedtime simply refused to sink. She was sighted intact, drifting unmanned through Arctic waters, repeatedly over the following decades, spotted intermittently by Inuit hunters, passing ships, and small local trading vessels as late as 1969, nearly 4 decades after her original crew first walked away from her across the ice, before she finally disappeared from the historical record for good, her ultimate final fate still genuinely unknown to this day. Near, what connects these 3 very different cases, a brigantine largely explained by careful science and patient historical detective work, a schooner whose fate remains genuinely and permanently uncertain, and a steel steamer that became a real, remarkably long-lived ghost ship in the most literal possible sense of that phrase, is how consistently the human imagination reached past the actual available facts towards something considerably more dramatic and satisfying. This is not really a criticism of the sailors, journalists, and storytellers who did that reaching over the years. Faced with a genuinely strange, deeply unsettling situation, an empty ship, sails still set, no clear answer anywhere to be found, it is entirely natural, perhaps even necessary, to want a story large enough to properly match the unsettling feeling of the mystery itself. The Bedtime story in particular has never fully closed, in a way that sets it apart from almost every other case in tonight's story. In 2006, decades after her last confirmed sighting in 1969, the state of Alaska formally organized a search effort specifically to try to locate whatever remained of her, recognizing that an intact steel hull adrift for so long represented both a piece of genuine maritime history and a potential hazard still worth accounting for. That search did not succeed in finding her and her final resting place, whether beneath the Arctic ice, broken apart in some remote stretch of open water, or simply sunk without anyone present to record it, remains genuinely unknown today, which means the Bedtime technically remains, in the strictest legal sense, an undischarged derelict somewhere in Arctic waters even now. What has survived, scattered across several institutions, are the smaller, more human traces left behind by these voyages. A university museum in Alaska holds a collection of ethnological specimens recovered from the Bedtime by later visitors who boarded her briefly during the 1930s before she drifted off again into the ice. A museum in Manitoba preserves photographs and company records documenting her working life for the Hudson's Bay Company, from her original construction in Sweden through her long years hauling furs and supplies along the Arctic coast. These are not dramatic artifacts. They are ordinary business records and salvaged household items, the kind of material any working ship might have generated. And it is precisely their ordinariness that makes them valuable, offering a documented, physical counterweight to the more sensational versions of these stories that circulated in newspapers at the time and have continued circulating in one form or another ever since. But the actual historical record that survives, preserved carefully in logbooks, Admiralty Court transcripts, contemporary newspaper archives, and the patient, painstaking work of later historians and oceanographers, tells a considerably quieter and in some ways far more affecting story than any of the legends. These were working ships, crewed by entirely ordinary people, doing an ordinary, genuinely difficult job, undone not by curses or sea monsters, but by real storms, small mechanical failures, treacherous coastlines, and the nearly impossible task of making exactly the right decision in a moment of genuine, overwhelming fear, armed with only the limited information available at that exact moment. The physical objects that survive from these voyages, Briggs's careful, honest logbook entries, the small domestic touches still visible in the Mary Celeste's preserved cabin, the salvaged furs and scientific specimens recovered from the drifting Bay Chimo before she finally vanished for good are quiet, physical reminders of exactly that ordinary human reality, still legible and moving more than a century later, right beneath all the legend that eventually grew up around them. So what actually caused a ship like the Mary Celeste to sail on empty, tables still set, cargo largely untouched, with no one left aboard to steer her home? Not a curse, and not a mystery genuinely beyond human explanation, but a frightened, deeply understandable decision made by an otherwise careful captain facing a violent storm, a fouled pump, and a hold full of restless, invisible vapor, all pressing in at once, far from any shore, in the middle of the night. We followed that same quiet human pattern across nearly a full century of maritime history tonight. A brigantine off the Azores, undone by ordinary mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. A schooner on the Diamond Shoals, caught between a genuinely violent storm and a treacherous, sand-choked coastline. A steel steamer far to the north in the Arctic, abandoned in good faith and somehow still drifting, unclaimed, decades later. Behind every one of these ships stood real, ordinary people, captains who knew their difficult trade well, families who shared the voyage together, and sailors who did the same steady, repetitive work, watch after watch after watch, that quietly kept any wooden or steel ship afloat and moving toward her next port. The legends that grew up around these particular ships, older still in their roots than any single one of them, reached instinctively for monsters and curses, because the plain, ordinary truth, a careful crew making an impossible choice under real and immediate pressure, can sometimes feel too quiet and too human to hold the full emotional weight of the mystery it left behind. But it is that quieter, more human truth which has actually lasted, preserved patiently in logbooks and Admiralty salvage records long after the more dramatic newspaper stories of any given decade faded from memory. There is something worth carrying with you from these stories beyond the particular facts of any single voyage. The ocean these sailors crossed was never truly empty, whatever the old legends liked to suggest. It was full of ordinary people doing careful, difficult work, following the same watches, eating the same simple meals, trusting the same instruments, night after night, for months at a stretch. Most of those voyages ended exactly as planned, with a ship arriving safely, her cargo unloaded, her crew paid and sent home to their families. It is only the rare, unlucky handful, undone by a fouled pump, a sudden storm, an unforgiving stretch of shoal water, that we remember by name at all. And even then, we remember them best not for what could not be explained, but for the very human, very understandable choices that were actually made aboard them. Somewhere in the Arctic tonight, a rusted steel hull may still rest quietly beneath the ice, entirely unrecovered to this day, exactly as she has been for most of a century. And somewhere in the historical record, a careful logbook entry, written by a tired captain who never once suspected it would be his very last, still marks the final known position of a ship that simply kept sailing onward, long after everyone who had ever called her home was gone. Thank you for listening, and good night.